Welcome everybody to this event today, discussion and debate event. I'm Lucy Delap, I'm the Deputy Chair of the History Faculty, and I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming everyone who's tuning in from around the world, particularly a big welcome to all of our alumni who are here today and everybody else who's joining us. Let me ask my co-presenters to all put their cameras on while I introduce everyone. So, we're talking today about the events of 100 years ago, although we'll be kind of fanning out quite a long time before that and after that to set the partition of Ireland and the Anglo-Irish Treaty into historical context and to think about how we ended up with that outcome, what effect it's had on British and Irish politics and society, and what other outcomes might have been possible or might be possible. Clearly a very controversial and timely topic. And so it's really fantastic to be joined by my three colleagues in Irish history for today's discussion. We're going to hear first from Dr. Niamh Gallagher. Niamh is a lecturer at the Faculty of History. She's a fellow of St. Catherine's College, and she's the author of Ireland and the Great War, A Social and Political History, which very excitingly came out in 2019 and then won the Royal Historical Society's 2020 Whitfield Prize. She of the Independent Historical Advisory Panel for Northern Ireland, and she recently gave one of the very high-profile MacNav 100 lectures at the invitation of the President of Ireland. We'll then hear from Richard Bourke, who's Professor of the History of Political Thought at the University of Cambridge, and he's a Fellow of King's College. He's written very widely on Irish history, as well as European intellectual history more generally, and his publications include Peace in Ireland, The War of Ideas, and the Princeton History of Modern Ireland. And he's co-editing the political thought of the Irish Revolution with Niamh Gallagher, which is going to be published early next year. Finally, we're going to hear from Professor Eugenio Biagini, who's Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Cambridge and also a Fellow of Sydney Sussex. Professor Biagini works on the social, economic and political history of democracy and the history of religious and ethnic minorities in Ireland and elsewhere. And his recent books, I won't give you the full list, there are so many, but his recent books include British Democracy and Irish Nationalism, 1876 to 1906, The Shaping of Modern Ireland, and the Cambridge Social History of Ireland since 1740. So we're going to plunge into the presentations, and I will ask all of our listeners, please, active listening, because there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and our panel are very keen to hear from you. They've all given us their take on the reshaping of these islands. So Niamh Gallagher, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucy, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Alumni Festival team for inviting me to be here today. So I want to begin by asking, was this question of whether partition was inevitable? And I want to tell you a little bit about how historians have conceived of that question in the historiography that's been written around it. And it mightn't surprise you that there is a strong trend in the historiography of modern Ireland in favour of what I'm going to call the inevitability thesis. The idea that the partition of Ireland was itself inevitable and no other outcome, though unfortunate, could be found. And this is a very common trend in writing from the 1970s and really right through even to the present. And some of these historians, and I'm going to speak in very general terms, might yield different dates as to when the partition of Ireland and therefore the reconfiguration of the United Kingdom became inevitable whenever it sort of started. And many dates include the Norman conquest, for example, back in the 12th century when Ireland was first settled by Anglo-Normans from England, establishing that sort of strategic relationship between Ireland and England that has resonated over the last 1,000 years. A more convincing series of dates are in the 1500s, amidst the plantations of Ireland, when hundreds of thousands of English and Scottish settlers came to Ireland, and particularly to that province of Ulster, the four provinces within Ireland, Ulster being the northern one, and Northern Ireland, which exists today, comes mainly out of Ulster. 6 counties are in that Ulster province. So that's a very convincing thesis for many of those who support this idea of inevitability, because those settlers who arrived in Ireland were themselves Protestant, and they were colonizing and settling in a country that was largely Catholic. And these religious categories of Catholic and Protestant have resonated throughout the ages. And of course, they still, in many ways, define life in Northern Ireland today. So one could draw a link between the mid-1500s and today, to evidence this fact that partition was itself inevitable. But other historians, and I would agree with them, would say that partition itself is a solution imposed by a state. Therefore, without a state where Ireland was united with Britain, there can be no partition or even inevitability to speak of. So therefore, we really want to talk about this period when Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom. And this is from 1801 right through until when Ireland partitioned in 1920, and indeed 1921 thereafter. So this is the second phase of my talk that I now want to speak about, those immediate years, that 120 odd year period. And those who support this idea of inevitability might give a range of different dates in that period to evidence their point. And while I can't talk about all of them, I'm just going to choose a handful just to show my point. So in 1831, for example, a system of primary education was established across the island of Ireland. And though the intention behind it was for it to be secular, in practice, of course, it ended up being very denominationally controlled. Again, something that's very true in Northern Ireland today. So people have drawn that link between 1831 and the segregation of education right through until the present. Some might even go to the end of the century in the 1890s, when there is a movement known as the Cultural Revival, not a united movement, but a disparate collection of poets, scholars, musicians, playwrights, etc., who are thinking about what it means to be Irish. And some very key individuals in this efflorescence of ideas about what it means to be Irish had a very strong connection between Catholicism and nationalism. So D.P. Moran, for example, who is a very influential writer in a journal called The Leader, and perhaps you might be even more familiar with Patrick Pearse, who is the leader of the 1916 Easter Rising, who read the proclamation of the Irish Republic outside the General Post Office in April 1916, the first day of the Easter Rising. So this link between Catholicism and nationalism is seen to be very much cemented by the end of the century. And this is supported by many nationalists who support this idea of home rule, which is a measure of self-government for Ireland. And the vast bulk of supporters for that movement are Catholic and nationalist, and those who are against it tend to be, and usually the opposite is given, Protestant and Unionist, those in favour of the United Kingdom. So there are a whole series of dates you can use in that 120-year period to join the dots as to why partition became inevitable. But equally, I would say, and others would agree, there are different dates one could choose to argue the opposite. And just a handful of these include 1798, so a couple of years before the Act of Union itself, or the Acts, plural, are passed in 1800, coming into operation on the 1st of January 1801. The 1798 rebellion, run by the United Irishmen, who were Presbyterian from Ulster with French connections. The rebellion that they had, a Republican insurrection against British authority, against Crown rule, was an alliance of Presbyterians and Catholics against predominantly Protestant Anglican class. So there's no easy division here between Protestant and Catholic stretching back to the 1500s. Instead, you have Presbyterian and Catholic against Anglican. So this idea of religious, unchanged religious homogeneity passing over centuries is troubled by this one example. And indeed, you could have several more. In the 1870s and 80s in Ireland, there are a series of what are called land wars, which are revolutionary, radical upheaval and against systems of land ownership throughout the island of Ireland. And while this relationship tends to be from tenants who are largely Catholic against landlords, a considerable portion of whom are Anglican, so Protestant, this religious divide is a good way to explain the land wars, because there are several Catholic landlords, and indeed there's also radicalism within Ulster from Presbyterian tenants. And those who run or sort of lead the movement for land reform within Ireland, Michael Davitt being a notable example, he also went to the Highlands in Scotland to try to encourage land reform there as well, from tenant against landlord. And that, of course, was heavily more Protestant in both the landlord sense and indeed in the tenant farmer sense. So this divide over religion, I don't think is a very adequate way for explaining the series of events that transpire in that long 19th century period, right up until 1912. And this is a more definable period I want to concentrate now in the final part of my talk, between 1912 through to 1920, with a little bit thereafter. And this is the period of the Third Home Rule crisis, when partition or any other solution for the so-called Irish question, so aptly named by authorities in London, became likely. And the Third Home Rule Bill only becomes possible when there is reform made to the House of Lords, constitutional reform. I won't say too much about it. So really the two prior Home Rule Bills in 1886 and 1893, really they're impossible without that reform of the Lords. So really the third one is the key one we're talking about when any constitutional change over this issue of Home Rule becomes possible, and a series, the events that transpire thereafter. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about what happened in those years, but I'm going to fast forward right through to 1919, early 1920, when various solutions for Ireland were being mooted. And partition, the way that it's sort of what it is today, was one of several solutions still on the table then. And some of them included what the followers of Herbert Asquith, who had the British Liberal Prime Minister, who led the United Kingdom into the First World War, what they had desired for a solution for Ireland, which is a simple county opt-out scheme, that counties that didn't want to be part of a self-governing Ireland could simply opt out. The fledgling Labour Party had other solutions and proposed making Ireland a dominion, much along the lines of Canada or Australia. So again, that solution avoided partition. So we can see that right up to the final hour, there's a whole host of different ways of thinking about what can be done over Ireland. And even after 1920, the idea that 1920 and the 1920 Act would have some sort of permanency thereafter can also be questioned, not least because Britain itself is experiencing lots of difficulties at the end of the First World War. In Europe, you have the collapse of empires and the creation of nation states. Britain is heavily indebted to its white dominions in India and America after the First World War, and it has imperial crises everywhere to manage, not least in Egypt, also in India, and of course then in Ireland. And within these islands, within Ireland and Britain, there is a war on the home front, so to speak, called the War of Independence within Ireland, called the Anglo-Irish War in other circles as well, because Ireland is still a part of the United Kingdom. And this war is ongoing when partition is passed in the middle of it. So how it would be resolved hasn't really, there's no predictability in that in 1920, 1921, and other possibilities may indeed have occurred. So I'm just going to wrap up and say in summary, I personally don't think that this idea that a centuries old tribalistic argument holds much weight. And even though those putting together particular chronologies that lead right through to the present can seem convincing, there are really alternative, equally important dates that complicate that picture and make it much more messy. So I suppose if I had to stake my claim on this, I would say partition wasn't inevitable, certainly for most of the period I've talked about now, but it's really a product and a question for thinking about that key period known as the Irish Revolution, those key years. And I'm now going to pass over to Richard Bourke to say a bit more. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So we are addressing today the question of whether the transformations which reconfigured relationships within these islands in the period 1920 to 21 were in some sense inevitable. Niamh Gallagher has addressed whether there was a high road to partition such that the outcome had in effect been finalized before the act itself was completed. Well, there were undoubted rigidities in British and Irish politics from 1912, which narrowed the scope for innovation on the part of legislators and activists. The future was not completely open to all participants in the drama for the obvious reason that each of the players envisaged incompatible eventualities. Yet for all the limitations which the protagonists imposed upon themselves and on one another, I'd like to argue that there was a certain fluidity to the period which historians tend to neglect. So my thesis to this extent chimes with Dr. Gallagher's claims. Eugenio Biagini will put a somewhat contrasting case. He will highlight the extent to which religion operated as a straitjacket on choice in the period. In this, there can be no doubt that Professor Biagini is drawing attention to a powerful inhibiting factor which directly shaped behavior, ruling certain possibilities out and so reducing the freedom to maneuver. whilst accepting the reality of these constraints and agreeing with the broad thrust of his remarks, I nonetheless want to argue that the precise pattern of the future was not completely predetermined. We're standardly told that nationalism and unionism were in irreconcilable conflict, at least since 1886, the year of Gladstone's first Home Rule Bill. Unable to discover common ground, the situations of modern Britain and Ireland were, on this analysis, foredoomed. Essentially, this implies that the end of empire, the independence of Ireland, and the partition of the island were all inescapable. Each of them was unavoidable, this argument holds, at least since the early years of the 20th century, if not much longer. But there are various considerations which this perspective neglects. Amongst these considerations, we might include the following facts. First, most unionists themselves never wanted partition. Two, most Irish nationalists before 1918 were not interested in independence. And three, both constituencies in Ireland, much like the leading British political parties, were happy to operate within an imperial context. So there was no monodimensional collision between nationalists and unionists. In fact, I would argue, in many respects, nationalists were themselves some kind of unionist, and unionists were also some kind of nationalists. I think the case for this conclusion is clear enough. So let me illustrate my point by resort to a still more taxing example. My claim is that the future was more open than it seems to us, although naturally I accept there were overwhelming impediments. On the side of the limitations, we might cite the obvious fact that there was a landslide, an electoral landslide in favour of Sinn Féin in 1918, with the result that the bulk of the Irish electorate was now committed to independence. But we still need to remember that independence did not come until 1948. Ireland remained a member of the Commonwealth long after 1921. The vast majority of those who debated the merits of the treaty were committed to the Republican cause. Yet this is my point. Even then, it was not definitively clear what republicanism actually meant. What seems finalized in retrospect was inconclusive at the time. So let me dwell on the case of the treaty. The Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland were signed at Downing Street on the 6th of December 1921 by the British delegation, along with 5 Irish representatives enjoying plenipotentiary status. Before ratification, the terms of the treaty were debated in sessions of the Second Dáil, convened at Earlsford Terrace over 15 days between 14 December 1921 and 7 January 1922. In the end, approval of the agreement passed by a margin of just 7 votes, though civil war rather than national concord ensued. One of the most controversial issues, arrangements for Ulster, had at least provisionally been settled in advance by the debates by an agreement to provide for a boundary commission that would decide on the character and viability of partition. That left relations between Ireland and the Empire as the principal issue in contention when the delegates gathered. Most controversial was the maintenance of an oath of allegiance to the British Crown under Article 4 of the treaty, together with the retention of naval facilities as set out in the annex to the agreement. Nonetheless, most contributors to the debate were agreed about one issue. That's the legitimacy and desirability of securing a republic. The only question was the means of achieving that objective. In entering into negotiations with the British, the Irish side had implicitly conceded a measure of compromise. As Michael Collins himself put it, and this is a quotation from the treaty debates, it was the acceptance of the invitation that formed the compromise. However, it remained to be established what might have to be bargained away. After the settlement, since the immediate establishment of a republic was forlorn, the question was whether the plenipotentiaries had yielded too much. Therefore, while a large majority of the 124 protagonists in the Dáil remained faithful to the same goal, They divided on which concessions entailed defeat for their shared ambition. De Valera asserted on the opening day of proceedings that, quote, the honor of this nation, which is dear to us, is at stake. Indeed, the value of honor was frequently invoked by TDs, suggesting that the dilemma involved fidelity to an ideal. Yet the real question was the extent to which deviation from that ideal threatened to undermine its integrity altogether. The achievement of a republic implied independence, although what this meant was subject to divergent interpretations, and that's really my point. What I want, what the people of Ireland want is not shadows but substances, remarked Sean McOwen, seconding Arthur Griffith's motion in support of the treaty. But what exactly was the substance of independence? Famously for Michael Collins, it meant the freedom to achieve freedom. Quoting him, he said, "In my opinion, it gives us freedom, not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop, but the freedom to achieve it." De Valera likewise accepted that the negotiations could not have delivered freedom in the sense of a complete autonomy, the complete autonomy of an isolated republic. Yet he believed they could have brought about a form of imperial association that was at least compatible with genuine self-government. De Valera spelled out the details of this in what he referred to as Document 2. In it, he sketched a form of what was termed external association with the British Commonwealth that prioritized domestic autonomy and the right to self-defense. Another contributor, Erskine Childers, advocated this potential setup by urging, in the following remarks, establish the principle that authority in Ireland belongs solely to the Irish people, then make your association and the rights of Ireland are safe. The oath of allegiance seemed to the opponents of the treaty to undermine this basic principle. So supporters of the treaty had described it as a form of dominion status in accordance with Article 1 of the agreement. This was expected to place Southern Ireland on a par with Canada and Australia. Yet Childers was anxious to explode the analogy. Ireland was a small neighbour, geographically bound to Britain, whereas Canada was a sizable portion of a remote continent, amounting to, as he put it, an immense nation, absolutely unconquerable by England, and what is even more important, attached to England by ties of blood. 2 days later, in a speech that lasted 2.5 hours, Mary McSweeney reiterated Casement's assessment and proceeded to reaffirm what she thought of as the fundamental Republican position. She, like her comrades, stood on principle, proclaiming what she termed an essentially spiritual ideal. It had always, she proclaimed, been a minority who redeemed the soul of the nation, as demonstrated by the 1916 Rising. The will of that minority could never be broken, she claimed, for even if England should exterminate, as she put it, and this again is a quotation from her contribution, if it should exterminate the men, women, and children of this generation, the blades of grass, dyed with their blood, will rise like dragon's teeth of old into armed men, and the fight will begin in the next generation. Well, to view the treaty debates as driven by radically competing ideals is largely mistaken. Instead, divisions were fomented by rival strategies whose partisans presented them as incompatible principles. "We Republicans are going to carry out this fight," announced McSweeney. "Death is preferable to honor," Constance Markiewicz declared in the same speech. The treatyites in due course opted to join battle. Well, as these exchanges show, conflict was real in Ireland, but its character was shape-shifting. The lines of division during the treaty debates were barely visible half a decade earlier. New circumstances threw up new contentions, redefining the field. As the Civil War itself showed, even the most bitter enmity proceeded from agreement among the protagonists about the basic commitments and principles. So could anyone have predicted a civil war in Ireland over the different interpretations of the implementation of republicanism before 1920? I think not. To this extent, the history of early 20th century Ireland was festooned with uncertainties as much as it was marred in intransigence. Thanks very much. I'll pass over to you now, Eugenio.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to take such a firm line or contrarian view. In fact, the view which I'm going to articulate is a little bit more nuanced. But as you have said, and indeed Niamh has said, one of the assumptions most frequently made about partition is about the centrality of religion and the importance of religion in the making of tribalism and in the mass socialization within each of the two communities, which were segregated. So at one level, there is no question the partition was ultimately about one issue, one obsessive issue, religious minorities and their oppression, real or imagined, anticipated or remembered. And this, of course, is the view, as Niamh was saying, which has been taken by many historians and politicians from Ernest Blythe in 1955 to most recently Charles Townsend in a book which came out just this year. In fact, at the weekend, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of Ireland, the Reverend David Bruce, sort of in a penitential mood, admitted that it was partly the responsibility of his community in sustaining the idea that Ulster should be, quote, a bulwark against Rome's inexorable advance. This was in the Irish Times. Now, it is true that Ulster was one of the religious frontiers within Europe and North America. There were a dozen other similar frontiers, for example, in Germany, in Switzerland, Hungary, and Romania, and indeed even Italy, and few of them corresponded to partition. Whereas, on the contrary, there were many partitions which had no religious barriers, for example, in South Tyrol after 1918, and likewise in Trieste and the rest of Istria to the present day, and in various boundaries in the Balkans. Well, this is not to say that religion does not matter. In fact, religion matters a lot, both in its confessional shape, in the institutional forms, such as, for example, of course, Roman Catholics versus Protestants, or in the Islamic world, Shia versus Sunni, or indeed it matters also as political religions. So the notion of political religion was elaborated by sociologists and historians such as George Mosse and Emilio Gentile to describe the sacralization of politics, that is the adaptation of semi-religious rituals, language, and forms of collective mobilization, which inspired, for example, most totalitarian regimes in Europe, or indeed in Asia, from 1933 until the present day. So this political religions phenomenon goes beyond the so-called secularization of society and culture. Politics is far more difficult to secularize, and in the 20th century, in particular, what we see is a widespread sacralization of politics. When as we move back to Ireland, there is a prima facie case for religion mobilizing Irish opinion in 1912, when partition really starts. Especially, there is evidence at the pre-political stage in terms of culture, which was grounded in a culture of partition or division or communal division, for example, through association such as the Hibernians, organizing Catholic opinion at a popular level, or indeed the Orange Order among the Protestants. However, we must bear in mind that religion provided not only a culture of division, but also a practice of compromise. In fact, religion encoded centuries of both conflict and compromise. And compromise was a tangible, everyday reality, for example, within farming communities, when farmers of different confessions would help one another with the harvest, with collecting the harvest during local emergencies, fires, for example, putting off fires. It was also evident in the business community both in terms of the commercial and trade relations between Protestant businessmen and shopkeepers, for example, and the Catholic customers, and also relations between business people and business leaders. Think, for example, of the 1913 strike and lockout in Dublin, where the most ecumenical cooperation and understanding was displayed by both Catholic and Protestant employers in crushing the strike of both Catholic and Protestant workers. And the leader of the employers was the Catholic William Martin Murphy. While of course Protestant businesses such as Guinness were traditionally more generous and more paternalistic in the handling of trade disputes, partly because they were aware of their vulnerability, expressing as they did a minority position. The Guinnesses were a Protestant family well known for their religious views. When we come to the actual unfolding of the events which led to partition, religion had a field day with the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant, which was signed on Ulster Day, the 28th of September, 1912. In all, 471,000 Ulster Protestants signed the Covenant and the Women's Declaration. So there was not just a men document, there was also a Women's Declaration, which said the same things. And these 471,000 people corresponded to about 1/3 of the population of Ulster, including children and Roman Catholics. So this was a very significant endorsement. And the contrast with the 1916 proclamation of the Republic, which was signed by only 7 people, all of them men, is striking. Of course, the comparison would be unfair for various reasons, which I can explain later if you like. But certainly the Covenanters or the signers, the people who signed the Covenant, indicated there was a very powerful support, political support for the position which the Covenant expressed. Now, the question is, how religious was this document? The point is that the argument in the Covenant are all secular. Moreover, the support behind the Covenant was not quite as unanimous as we might think. In fact, about 25% of Ulster Protestants refused to sign it. When I say refused, they had to stand up for the principle against community and customer pressure. Ministers had to defy their congregations in many cases. Contrary to what you might expect, the more hardline Protestants, evangelicals, were actually divided. In fact, most of them were against the Covenant because the function, the raison d'etre, was to preach the gospel to all people who wanted to hear it, and Roman Catholics in particular. So you don't preach the gospel to people if you mobilize paramilitary troops or paramilitary organizations against them. And there is massive evidence that the church in the South was strongly against the Covenant, from the bishops down to humble congregations of Baptists and Methodists. The Methodists, in fact, hosted in their Christian Advocate one of the most interesting debates about the Covenant. And it is amazing how this debate, which consisted of hundreds of letters, produced a clear map of how opinion was divided. It was North versus South. Most Southern Protestants were strongly against the Covenant for very religious reasons. It was also the lay people against the ministers. Most Methodist ministers were against the Covenant. Why? For 2 main reasons. First of all, it was their function to preach the gospel to whoever wanted to listen to it. And second, the Methodists had the system of rotation. So unlike Church of Ireland rectors or Presbyterian ministers who were basically devoted to the care of one community for most of their career, a minister in the Methodist Church would move from one parish to the other, or from one congregation to the other, and this could be and was usually across Ireland. And they were familiar with Catholic communities. They could not really demonize them or be scared by them. They knew what they were talking about. But they came, as I said already, under pressure to sign. Many of them refused, and many of them stood up for their principles. But this is not all. Many of the people who actually signed were not sure what they were signing up. For example, will they sign up a revolutionary document to start a war against the British Empire? Surely not. Carson himself, Edward Carson, presented the document, the covenant, as something whose ultimate function was not to bring about partition, but to avoid home rule. His claim was that there would not be home rule if Ulster declared that they were against it. There could not be home rule for Ireland if Ulster was not in support of home rule. And of course, this brings us to the wider question. If the covenant was not religious, if people were confused, and if religious people were against partition, how significant was religion in partition? And here we must distinguish two meanings of religion. Religion is an ideology, and the effects of religion as an ideology on people's mind can be as powerful as any the effects of any secular ideology, or indeed political theory. But religion is also a set of beliefs concerning spiritual life, accountability to a supreme being, and a moral encoding a set of moral obligations. And the impact of religion in this second sense of the word is much more complex. So where does this leave us with reference to the question whether religious divides made partition inevitable between 1912 and 1920? Now, a religion became important for partition because it was used to scare people into adopting positions which were more radical than the position they would have otherwise adopted. These people, it must be said, they were not uniquely prejudiced or bigoted, far from it. Much of the responsibility for the polarization of this period must be laid at the door of the Roman Catholic Church. The Church adopted at the time position that antagonized a good cross-section of European society. And I don't mean primarily Protestants, I mean socialists, anarchists who were militantly atheistic, liberals, and Democrats in general, Republicans, for example. And anti-clericalism on the continent, especially in Catholic countries, during the first half of the 20th century, and indeed even in the 19th century, hostility to the Catholic Church was much stronger than anything you see in Ireland. And of course, it culminated with the most violent episodes in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s up to 1939. Yet, going back to what the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland was writing at the weekend, we must also say that there is little evidence that in 1912 there was any need for Ulster to become a bulwark against Rome's inexorable advance. And that is because there was no such a thing as Rome's inexorable advance in 1912. Quite the opposite. At the time, it was Protestantism that was advancing, not only in Ireland, but especially in Catholic Europe, and of all places in Italy. And Ulster, and indeed Irish Protestants, shouldn't have known that because they just endowed the Italian Presbyterian Church with a magnificent building to house an expanding faculty of theology in Florence. At the time, however, it was decided to ignore this evidence. That is, the people who had the means and the power to advertise what the situation was like decided to turn a blind eye and to shut their mouth when they came to this particular aspect of the relationship between the religious groups and the dynamics within between confessions in Europe. Instead, the religious differences were weaponized, and the conflict was sectarianized. In conclusion, if by religious differences making partition inevitable, we mean that religious differences would have made this phenomenon, this outcome, as in some sense of the word, irresistible, because it was like the strength of an impersonal force, such as a river or a hurricane. Well, in this sense of the word, certainly the answer must be that religion did not make partition inevitable. And in fact, insofar as religion is identifiable in any historical sense of the word, it should be said that its significance as religion in the whole process of partitioning Ireland is, to say the least, to be investigated and to be discussed very carefully before we reach any specific conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers for wise words and provocative reflections, and it's given us a lot to think about. Now, the questions are coming in already. Thank you for your active listening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point the questions to a panelist. I want to try and give everyone the chance to ask a question. So I'm going to address the question to a specific person. The first question is from David Newman, and David asked, and I think this is really related to the earlier presentations, because there has been some discussion about the covenant in Professor Biagini's presentation. But he also asks about the UVF, and I'm going to just gloss that question by saying, what about the gun? What about ideologies of violence? Where did the UVF or alternatives, Irish volunteers and so on fit into this story? And I'm going to ask Niamh, what's your feeling about the kind of the question of violence in these conflicts?
Yeah, thank you, Lucy, and for that question, David. Clearly, violence is important, and 1913 is a very key year, both for the UVF, whom had a very large number of men. I can't remember the exact figure, but well over 100,000 who joined the organization. And then a respective organization called the Irish Volunteers also amassed in that year in 1913. So there were, in effect, two polarized militia-like forces in Ireland with varying levels of access to the gun. So just very briefly on that point, Unionists had managed to secure quite a considerable catchment of arms from Germany through the Larne gun runnings in April of 1914. They got something like 25,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition. Nationalists were unsuccessful in their gun running attempts from Germany. They were the arms were found before they got landed in Dublin, and indeed a sort of kerfuffle broke out on Bachelor's Walk, whereby those who were supporting the importation of armaments formed a crowd, and a detachment of the British Army were brought in. Things got out of hand, and there were civilians who were shot dead. So you have very disparate outcomes at the end of 1913 in terms of who is successful in getting some armaments into Ireland and who wasn't. Now, violence is important, but I think in the history of Ireland, we are very good at condensing the reasons as to why thousands of men joined an organisation into an overarching ideology. Now, this isn't to say that ideology is not important, but with any war in history, there are many motivations why people join organisations. Some related to masculinity, for example. The importance and power of having a rifle is seen to be really key right throughout Irish history, that's North and South, and remains so today. If your friends and peer group are joining up, there's a lot of peer pressure as to why you join an organisation. To wear a uniform, to march, to drill, all of these sorts of things become and are invested with a lot of social respect if given the wider consent by a wider community. Men outside that age who can join, women, for example. And these are motivations that cut across both nationalist and loyalist or unionist divides. So I think while the ideologies and the polarities that Professor Biagini has done a really good job of bringing to the fore in relation to religion, of course, are certainly important, to condense why people join these organizations into one overarching ideology seems to me misguided, just as it does for thinking about why so many men joined the Fenians in Ireland in the 1860s. Both in Ireland itself and in Canada, and R.V. Comerford wrote a really interesting book about this as to why the revolutionary organization, the Fenian Brotherhood, took off as well as it did right throughout parts of America, and then later on in Canada, of course, but also in Ireland. So I'm gonna stop there and just say it's important, but really let's not ascribe singular motivations and meanings to the power of the so-called gun within Ireland, and nor should we think that there were many, many guns within Ireland capable of something like civil war in 1913, because there simply weren't.
Thanks very much, Niamh. Okay, the next question is from Martin, and I'm going to pose this one to Eugenio. The question is asking the kind of equation of home rule and Rome rule, how far was that borne out in the kind of the evolving relationship between the Free State government and the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular, why or how did it reach a high point with the Eucharistic Congress of 1932?
This is a very interesting question. In fact, my research, which has not been published yet, or it's only partly published, shows that the 1920s and 1930s, despite the Eucharistic Congress, saw a relaxation of the relations between Protestants and Catholics. For example, outdoor preaching, colporteurs were able to operate with a freedom which had been unknown under the Union. And this applies across the island. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. I was looking in various ways for incidents, and most of the police interventions against open-air preachers are actually by the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the north. So there is a way in which, of course, there are also reasons about which I could explain why this changed. But one important change which took place in the aftermath of independence, that Protestantism in the South ceased to be associated with politics. And this made the position of individual preachers and communities easier. It does not mean that there was no boycotting, there was no violence, especially during the Civil War and in between the Anglo-Irish War and the Civil War. There was, whether this was sectarian or inspired by political reasons, there is massive evidence it was unionists who were targeted, not religious people in general, is another matter. I should also say a brief word about the UVF question earlier on. When we speak of the Ulster Volunteer Force before the First World War, it's not the same creature or the same organization with which we are familiar, sadly, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It was a much more traditional Victorian or late Victorian organization that had been armed volunteers in Britain between 1861 and the end of the century. The right to bear arms was not just an American invention, was a British one. And basically, the state didn't do much at the beginning because there was no legislation to prohibit people from arming and drilling. In fact, of course, there was much evidence that people who were armed and drilled used to be very keen on keeping the law and not breaking it, which is paradoxical and difficult to understand from our vantage point, but nevertheless, there was a different world, different from the one in which we live.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. Okay, we've got a question here from Tom. Tom asks, did the Loyalists push partition as an option that would be unacceptable enough to sabotage Home Rule? Richard, what's your thought on that?
Yes, I can be very quick on that, just simply because Eugenio mentioned it earlier when he referred to it being the sort of prospect of partition being a sort of wager which was designed to scupper Home Rule altogether. So that's indeed the case. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, thanks. And Richard, maybe I can just push you on to Ian Dalton's question, which is the next one on the list. The treaty delegation had 2 Protestants on its team. What influence did that have on how they approached the negotiations? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Robert Barton was a Protestant and he was on the delegation. Also, incidentally, Erskine Childers, who I quoted from his own treaty contributions, he was secretary to the delegation. Well, they were committed Republicans, so to that extent, the religious affiliation wasn't as one would have expected. If anything, for instance, Childers was associated with a rare form of Republican fanaticism. I don't know if people want to argue that's overcompensation. I don't think that's correct because his position actually changed dramatically over a sort of 6-year period. So the short answer is no, it didn't make a difference. They were committed Irish Republicans, and in a way there's nothing unusual about that. Irish Republicanism is a Protestant invention, as Niamh mentioned, from the 1790s. So we associate this with a sort of Catholic fundamentalism, but historically speaking, it was a Protestant doctrine and has a long tradition of Protestant commitment to the Republican cause. And as the questioner the point the questioner is making, also represented at the debates in London in 1920-21.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to everyone who's posed questions. We are going to have to call it an end now because everyone's got their evening to get to or other events in the Alumni Festival. So if you do have other questions, you can always drop our speakers a line. Watch out for their published work, and they're all active in public life, so you'll see them in the Irish Times and other formats. It's been fabulous to have them all here. It's given us a really interesting picture of contingency, of a future where there's all to play for, of a future where the divides cannot be taken for granted, and there are unlikely to be easy answers, and a very useful thing to hold in mind, I think, when we think about the contemporary situation with borders and partition in Ireland. So I'd like to thank the Alumni Festival, thank our participants, and especially thank you to our panelists for their time this evening. It's been really lovely to have everybody here. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.